whatever time of day it is, and it's my pleasure to be introducing today Father Michael Collins for his latest instalment in this series of talks that he's been giving for the Longevity Forum. I'm Andrew Scott, one of the co-founders of the Longevity Forum. Now, the majority of you already know Father Michael, so I'll keep my introduction short. But those of you who don't, who are new today, Father Michael has been giving a number of sessions that have been informing and interesting us about a range of issues connected to art, life, and humanity, going right back to Egyptian times. And I'm delighted today that he's turning his attention to Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which of course is a piece of art teeming with life and humanity, set in a pilgrimage and includes many religious figures. So very much looking forward to Father Michael's views on this great work of literature. And if I cast my mind back to school days, I can remember Chaucer saying of the clerk in the Clerk's Tale that he gladly would learn and gladly teach, which seems a great description of Father Michael. Father Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I appreciate your very kind words. I suppose in a sense, we're probably here a little bit by false pretenses, because I wanted to talk perhaps not so much about the Canterbury Tales, but the Canterbury Trails. And the idea is, as you say, the question of longevity that occupies us is to look back and see how people lived and survived indeed in the past, and then how today we can learn from their experience. So the Canterbury Tales is a set of stories, short little stories, which were to accompany a group of pilgrims as they made their way basically from London to Canterbury. But what I've chosen is a set of images which will help us focus on what life was like in those days and show what the pilgrims, what the people saw at that time. So it's perhaps not so much an example or an exploration of the Canterbury Tales themselves, but to travel along the Canterbury Tale, which we begin today. And in our next session, we'll cross the English Channel into France and carry on the journey, which will bring us to Rome. And so we open this session with our images. The Canterbury Tales is one of the great pieces of English literature which we probably all should have read. We know the name, we know the author, Geoffrey Chaucer, or Godfrey Chaucer, according to the pronunciation, but the majority of us haven't actually read the text itself. And it's a fascinating text because it opens up a window into the medieval world. And we are going to make a two-part journey. The journey we're taking is, first of all, from London to Canterbury. And on our next meeting, we're going to cross the Channel into France, over the Alps, into Italy, and onwards to Rome. And the whole purpose of our meeting during these visits is to understand the medieval way of life, and also to comprehend how people 500, 600, 700 years ago lived, the quality of life they lived. And as we extend our longevity, as we have longer lives into the future, many of the young generation are going to hit 100 and plus. Our focus is to try and prepare them with their financial security, with their health, with their mental stability, so that they can make the best of all that is offered to them in the future. So today, the pilgrim route is going to take us from Canterbury in present-day Kent, England, across Europe to Rome, to the shrine of Peter. So we start at the shrine of St. Augustine and St. Thomas of Beckett, and we follow a medieval route which will bring us to different parts of Europe, which are fascinating in themselves, beautiful, with wonderful food, wonderful weather, wonderful treasures, wonderful everything. And over the last 20 years, a lot more people have started joining the Via Francigena. And the Via Francigena is simply a name which was used to describe the French path, or the French way, crossing over from England on the way to Rome. In the past 20 years, it has been brought back to life. It had been abandoned for several centuries, and now is once more, in the same way as our last visit to Santiago de Compostela, is a pilgrimage path which has been covered by thousands of people every year. So around the late 6th century, the abbot of the Chalian monastery in Rome, a man called Gregorius, was passing through the marketplace in the city, and he saw two blonde, blue-eyed young people. And he said to his secretary, "Quid sunt? What are they, or who are they?" And the secretary said, according to the story, "Angles sunt." They're Angles. They come from, if you like, Anglia in Latin. And the abbot then, with a sense of humor, said, "Non Angles sed Angeles sunt." They're not angels, but they're angels. Now, a short time later, he was elected Pope. But prior to that, prior to taking the name Pope Gregory I, and eventually being called Pope Gregory the Great in 590, he had been the Prefectus Urbae, the Prefectus Romae. So he was the Lord Mayor, if you like, of Rome. He was the governor, he was the organizer, the chief administrator in civil matters. And then he decided to throw it all in and become a monk. So having, if you like, received one of the most important jobs in the Roman world at that time, literally it was the New York of the empire. So having received that important commission, he then decided, no, he wanted to live a quiet life as a monk. But he didn't last very long there, because upon the death of the previous Bishop of Rome, the previous Pope, he was called from the monastery and obliged to take this job. He's celebrated now as the codifier of liturgical music. And in fact, we still use his name for plain chant, the official music of the church, which we sometimes refer to as Gregorian chant. He then, shortly after his election, he sent one of his monks, Augustine, to Anglia. And it probably was Augustine who, according to the legend, according to the story, had said to Gregory that these were angles. So the young Augustine was sent over. He landed in Kent. He met the king, Ethelbert, and he baptized him. And in that moment of baptism, of course, at that time, and we're going to see subsequently in the medieval period, when a monarch converted, the people were expected to convert as well. And that's why we find in the history of Europe vast swathes of countries which become Christian, not through necessarily any personal conviction, but simply because the monarch had been baptized and had taken the name. So when Augustine set up his base in Kent, when he set up his church, it became a cathedral. The word cathedral comes from the Latin cathedra, meaning the seat, and the seat stands for the position of authority or of teaching. And Augustine set up a monastery similar to the monastery which he had left in Rome on the Caelian Hill. And Gregory, when he left, had given the young monk Augustine some advice. He said, go to the temples which you find, they're all pagan temples, but tear down the idols and sprinkle holy water and consecrate them to the Lord. So that also helps us understand how many of the great Roman buildings were preserved. They were not destroyed and torn down, but they were kept on and preserved for future generations. So geographically, just to get an idea of where we're looking at the moment, the red area is the area more or less of modern day Kent, and Canterbury is on the west coast of Kent, very close to the French coast, as you see on the bottom right-hand corner. So Canterbury Cathedral today, and Canterbury as a town, is a name which is synonymous with culture, with pilgrimage, with literature. And it's because perhaps of the Canterbury Tales that we're so familiar with the story of Canterbury itself. A wonderful Gothic church was built on the original site of Augustine's church, which he had built in the late 6th, early 7th century, a building of wood. It was then replaced in the 11th century, within 10 years, in fact, a very, very rapid construction made from stone. And then over the years, the nave was modified, especially in the 14th and in the 15th centuries, but it became a very important pilgrimage point and site. In the 12th century, the Lord Chancellor of England, Thomas Beckett, was elected the Archbishop of Canterbury to be a successor of Augustine. Already 5 centuries had passed by. Canterbury had become the prime see, or the prime ecclesiastical centre of England. This was the most important job in the realm after the king, but the king was annoyed shortly after the appointment of Thomas to the See of Canterbury, because while the two had been great friends, the king and the archbishop had been great admirers of each other and had supported each other, even though the chancellor was always the servant of the king. Nevertheless, when elected Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas had a change of character and he became very austere. He gave up his life of hunting, of feasting, and he reprimanded the king also on various issues, so much so that he was obliged to take refuge in France for a number of years. The king lamented to his knights that the Archbishop of Canterbury was causing him great difficulties, and 4 knights travelled to Canterbury, where they assassinated the Archbishop in his own cathedral. Immediately, a cult grew up around the person of Thomas à Becket, and he was declared a saint. King Henry II, the King of England, had disputed his rights and privileges and the rights and privileges of the church, and was certainly implicated in his murder, even though he had blamed his knights acting without his authority. But within a very short number of years, he was canonized. And therefore, after 1173, just 2 years after his death, a cult grew up around the life and death of Thomas à Becket, and he became popular both in England and in France. His relics were venerated in Canterbury, where he was buried, and mementos or portions of his belongings and indeed of his body were kept in reliquaries and enshrined in other churches. And so the cult of Thomas à Kempis grew. The Cathedral of Canterbury was a very important centre of monasticism right up through the time of Thomas à Becket until the period of the Tudors of Henry VIII, when all the monasteries after the mid-16th century were closed and their possessions despoiled. Here we have a medieval monastery manuscript which gives an account of all the names of the monks. There were about 70 to 90 monks at the period that this was written, and we'll find that the majority of these men came from Canterbury and in the environs. The most important name, which is associated, of course, with Canterbury, is the Canterbury Tales. The Canterbury Tales is one of the most important works of English medieval literature, and some 90 copies survive from the first publication in the year 1400. The author was Geoffrey Chaucer, a diplomat in service at the Royal English Court. The tales were written in Middle English, the language that developed after the Norman invasion of 1066, when the ruling class would have spoken French. The upper, the aristocratic, the educated class spoke French. The Canterbury Tales has been in constant print since the 600 centuries from the death of Chaucer, and it has inspired other writers and artists, and indeed pilgrims, who are testimony to the enduring appeal of his characters. Chaucer follows the journey of a group of pilgrims as they make their way to Canterbury. They are 31, including Chaucer himself, who's the ghost writer, if you like, from the Tabard Inn in Southwark in London to the shrine of St. Thomas at Canterbury Cathedral. The host at the inn, a man called Harry Bailey, a jovial character by all accounts, proposes to the group that each of the pilgrims would tell 2 tales on the way out and 2 on the way home to help while away their time on the road. Pilgrimages were extraordinarily important in this period, and it's so difficult for us to understand. We now have turned pilgrimages into holidays, but they had a much more serious intent in the medieval period. And if we can think back to the Black Death, 1348 onwards, and again in 1360, a plague, a bubonic plague spread by rats and fleas, had spread throughout Europe, decimating the population of the continent. Some 40%, even up to 60% of towns and cities lost their inhabitants. So people believed that God was behind all of this, and God's power could control or change the terrors which they were experiencing. And people were highly aware of the importance and the closeness of death. Think again that there was huge mortality in the young age group and in the old age group. So the span of life was probably no more than 30 or 40. So you had a period of perhaps from 20 to 30 when you were healthy, if you managed to get through your childhood, and then your old age would be racked by pain, by difficulties, etc. There were no antibiotics, there were no magic pills, there were no paracetamol, nothing to take away the difficulties of life. And therefore, the importance of pilgrimage was hugely appreciated by the people of that era. According to Harry Bailey, whoever tells the best story will be rewarded by a free dinner upon their return at the inn. So who were the characters? Well, we know that there was a knight, squire, yeoman, prioress, a monk, a friar, a merchant, an Oxford cleric, a man of law, franklin, a guildsman, a cook, a shipman, a skipper, physician, the wife of Bath, the most amusing of all the characters, a parson, a ploughman, a miller, a manciple, a reeve, a summoner, and pardoner. Now, many of these words are no longer familiar to us because they don't exist in our vocabulary anymore. But in those days, as Chaucer chose his list of characters, his dramatis personae, he knew exactly what they were, who they were. And so he uses them to provide us with a set of thumbnail portraits, which also tell us a great deal about medieval life. We hear tales from a monk and a prioress, from a carpenter and a cook, a priest and a knight, and the much married wife of Bath. The tales, most of which had a moral attached to it, tell us a great deal through the mouths of the idealized characters about how people thought, and all the stories show an amusing mix of classical knowledge and vulgar humor mixed together. Society was feudal in those days, with the landowners letting out their territories to sharecroppers who worked the land on their behalf. It was at the end of the 15th century when William Caxton made Chaucer's great work available to the masses. And with the arrival of the set press, the set printing press, we find paper being used for the first time in medieval Europe. And paper itself was going to revolutionize communications. Prior to that, people used vellum to communicate or wax tablets. But now paper, which was more durable until it got damp, which could accept ink, and which could be replicated with printing. And therefore, the Canterbury Tales was one of those early books produced in the late 1470s, about 1477, the initial trial copies, and 1478, the publication. And so the book itself, the Canterbury Tales, has never been out of print in the intervening centuries. Chaucer explains that when April comes, people begin to think about doing a pilgrimage. Obviously, in the British Isles, the weather is not as warm as in other parts of the Mediterranean. And therefore, when the winter is over, those who had sown the land could now set out on their pilgrimage. At this time, the main institutions of the era were the aristocracy and the church. The newly emerging universities had not yet gained the influence that they would have in later centuries. Chaucer brings his characters to life with a blend of satire and their foibles. The early readers, who were few, and keep in mind, of course, literacy was very restricted at that period, they may have read a copy of the tales to the largely illiterate public. So therefore, if you were literate and had the gift of being able to read, you would be able to share your knowledge with other people. And again, keep in mind, we're in the era prior to cinema, television, photography, the internet, the radio. All the things which we now take for granted did not exist at that period. And we know indeed that some people made a living from reading such books. The Canterbury Tales, therefore, open a window into English life during the 14th century. Chaucer's original plan was for over 100 stories to be written. But only 24 were completed, some of which he adapted from several earlier stories which he had composed prior to the summoning together of the Canterbury Tales. The publication of the text by William Caxton in 1478 ensured their survival. And so these characters have now passed into everyday life. The printing press had a revolutionary impact upon people in the mid-15th century. So what do we learn from the Canterbury Tales? What do they tell us? The stories themselves show us that the people were very well educated. And we sometimes look back on the medieval period and think it was an era of superstition, of simple pious stories, a blind faith in the Christianity which had spread throughout the European continent. But on the contrary, we find that the people of the stories of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales were well educated, they knew their classics, and they lived a fascinating life. It must have been extraordinary, though, to set out on a journey, even though from London to Canterbury is not a long distance, just a few hundred miles. Nevertheless, it was an opportunity to meet each other. And also, this was the era prior to holidays. We have to wait until Thomas Cook arrives in the 19th century before people began to take annual leave and annual holidays. And even the idea of taking a day off work is completely novel. That didn't exist. The weekends, as we have them today, did not exist. So what do people have for their free time? They had church holidays. So the most obvious would have been Christmas and Easter, and then Pentecost, and other feast days, especially those connected with the life of Mary and some of the saints. And so peppered throughout the calendar of the year were feast days upon which people would take a day off, and they would celebrate usually with a feast and some drinking. And perhaps they needed a day off to recover. And perhaps that is the idea of the two-day holiday of the weekend that we have, Saturday and Sunday, a day to enjoy and rejoice and a day to recover and recuperate. We leave our pilgrim as he's now ready, packed and dressed for the next stage of his pilgrimage. And when we meet again, we will accompany our pilgrim as he crosses on a ship bound for France to go across onto the continent, where he's going to travel down southwards, going through the French territories, across into Switzerland, over the Alps, and into the plains of Milan and into Italy, where he eventually will arrive at the second of the great pilgrimage sites, or arguably, in the European mind, the first of the great pilgrimage sites after Jerusalem, the shrine of Peter at Rome.
Well, thank you,
Okay.
Father Michael. That was wonderful. So we have a few questions. Let me just get Father Michael back on video. All right, here we are. Okay, Father Michael. So first question, when was the Canterbury pilgrimage popular, and did the Canterbury Tales increase the popularity of the pilgrimage?
Well, I'd say that's probably a two-part question. The first section, as we saw, was when Augustine became the founder of Canterbury, and obviously over the intervening centuries, until the time of Thomas of Becket, there would have been a devotion to Augustine and that whole setup of the church. And of course, the royal court was based in Anglia at that time. Then it was really given an impulse with the martyrdom of Thomas of Becket, which was as much a political move as a spiritual move. But nevertheless, as often happens in European history, the church was a political movement, and the papacy used this in order to impose its power on England in a particular way. When did the Canterbury Tales give that injection? I would say that it was because of the Canterbury Tales that people began to listen and hear more. And as Andrew said at the very beginning, we all know about the Canterbury Tales. It's one of the great foundation rocks of English literature, but it also opens a window for us into the medieval world. But at that time, when people were listening to the stories being told, it all must have come alive. I remember a few years ago visiting Colombia, and I was amazed. I'm talking probably over 20 years ago. There were people walking around with maybe 5 or 10 mobile phones strapped to their belts, and they rented out the phones so that there were people taking the phones and telephoning their family and friends. And the one person in the middle was taking all the money. He was a human telephone exchange, if you like. Nowadays, of course, that's all gone, and everybody seems to have a mobile phone of their own. It's something that you just can't live without. So I suppose that kind of helps us understand a little bit of what the world was like. That set of tales brought somewhere like Canterbury to life and made everybody want to go there.
Great. Now, if we only have a handful of original copies, I think you said we have 90 copies that were originally printed.
Yes.
How many were estimated to be in circulation in the beginning in the 14th century?
Well, probably not that many, because we find that books were expensive. They weren't produced in the tens of thousands as they are today. I would say, first of all, I have to admit that I don't know. That's the first thing. But an educated guess might be that there were no more than perhaps maybe 1,000, 1,500 printed. That would be a very generous amount, because they're expensive to go buy. Even if you think right to the time of the Pickwick Papers of Charles Dickens, people didn't buy the whole book. They went every week to the bookseller where 4 or 6 or 8 pages of one of the characters of the Pickwick Papers was sold. And you collected them together, and maybe after a year or 2 years, when Dickens had come to the end of his particular book, you went down to your bookbinder and you had it bound into a book, you brought it home, and then it was passed around to your aunts, your uncles, your nephews, your nieces, your grandparents, everybody. So the book was not just for one person, it was for lots of people.
And that was before the printing press, right? The beginning?
Well, yes, Caxton came along with a printing press, if you like, but obviously Gutenberg comes in the 1450s and he brings in the movable printing press, the movable typeface, which changes things and it makes it even more economical and more rapidly printed. So that also had an important impact at that time.
And leading into this, now, what was the literacy rate at the time?
Well, literacy, I would say, was low, because it was confined to what we would call the educated classes, and they were generally in the area of law and in the church as well. Monks and clergy generally had to be literate in order to read their various texts and the Eucharistic prayers, etc. So I would say that literacy was very much confined to a small amount of people. And I think it would be very difficult to try and work out what that band was across Europe, because different countries would have had different levels. But the majority of people were illiterate.
Yes, yes, of course. And last question. Now, this is a simple one, and it's a task that's really good for longevity. Did the pilgrims walk?
They did. Almost everybody walked. Yeah, almost everybody walked. Because again, nowadays we can hop into our car, catch a train, jump on a bus, jump in and out of a helicopter, whatever you want. But in those days, it was Shanks mare. Everybody walked. Only the very wealthy were able to afford horses, or perhaps even a mule. But no, the vast majority of people would have walked. And that's why it took so long to make your pilgrimage. And that's why Chaucer invented these sets of stories to keep people amused. Because from time to time, as you're trudging along, especially if the weather wasn't good, you can get sometimes in England, it can rain during the summer as well. So if you're trudging along during a summer storm, you probably wanted something to distract you.
Great. Good point. Now, thank you so much again, Father Michael. This was really interesting and took us back to our school days. Now, please check our website, thelongevityforum.com. We will be having more webinars by Father Michael as part of his Longevity Tonic series, as well as our big annual event, the Longevity Forum and Longevity Week, which will be happening 15 to 19 November. And we have lots of partner events on our website, as well as our annual forum, which will be in Glasgow, focusing on the environment and its effects on longevity. So please check our website, and I'm just going to leave you with a video on Longevity Week. Thank you again, Father Michael.
Thank you.